Welcome to EPG Pathshala. This is Dr. Madhupana Roy Chaudhary of Calcutta University. The paper I am going to talk on is Indian Polity, and the module name is Polity in the Epics. Now, before I come to the discussion of how the state system can be gleaned from the two epics, Ramayana and Mahabharata, let me give you in brief the learning objectives. There are some objectives behind giving the lecture. First of all, we have to understand the importance of epic as source of early Indian history. Then we are going to talk about the epic historiography. In order to give you an understanding of the epic polity, it's important to draw a comparison with other contemporary texts. And finally, statecraft and theories of kingship in the epics will be discussed in brief. Now, let me give you a short introduction about the importance of the study of epics as a source of history. The expansion of archaeological research in the 19th century contributed to the development of history as a scientific discipline. It also resulted in a dismissive attitude towards the Itihasa Purana tradition as a source of accurate historical knowledge. However, scholars like Hemchandra Ray Chaudhary made valiant attempts to read history from the epics, frequently supplementing information drawn from the two great epics with other contemporary texts. Now, in this, what I wanted to say that from the 19th century, there was the development of archaeological knowledge, and history based on objective archaeological sources came to be given more importance. It certainly helped in the development of history as a scientific discipline, but at the same time, the age-old practice of relying on the Itihasa Purana tradition of history writing came to be targeted as an object of ridicule. And as a result, the Itihasa Purana tradition and the constituents of it, that is the epics and the Puranas, came to be considered as unreliable for writing objective history of ancient India. So we find here that there were some scholars like Hemchandra Ray Chaudhary or Haraprasad Shastri who were designated as nationalist historians, but they did not consider the epics to be completely useless, and they started doing, they started making the importance of epics visible to the common readers. The most important book of A.C. Roy Chaudhary, which can be regarded as a magnum opus or a classical work, is Political History of Ancient India. Hemchandra Ray Chaudhary began the book from the discussion of Parikshit and Janmejayo. Those are legendary figures belonging to the house of the Kurus, and the other figure who also came to be considered as a historical figure was Raja Janaka of Videho, who is considered to be the father of Sita in the epic Ramayana. Now, the treatment of Hemchandra Ray Chaudhary for Parikshit has been discussed by Professor B.N. Mukherjee to be an attempt to find in Parikshit the symbol of integrationism in the period of the epic. He finds that through the treatment of Parikshit, he was striving to come at a central theme of historical development in ancient India through a conflict between centripetal and centrifugal forces. So in Parikshit, he tried to find the symbol of integrationism. Yet, writing the political history of ancient India on the basis of epic genealogies or Puranic genealogies always raises problems concerning historical evidence. Why is it so? Why are the epics not so reliable for writing objective history of ancient India? Because one very important constituent of the epic is poetic imagination, myths and legends. So this poetic imagination limits the importance of epics as proper historical evidence. It is true that later on scholars like B.B. Lal, under the Archaeological Survey of India, and many other archaeologists conducted researches in the archaeological sites, major archaeological sites mentioned in the two great epics. And the archaeological excavations have yielded some amount of information, but these information are not adequate, or we can say the archaeological discoveries have not been able to confirm all the accounts that we derive from the literary text. So even though archaeology was there to establish the validity of the epic tales, but they have not been able to corroborate the importance of the epics as authentic source of ancient Indian history. So after we have given you a brief discussion on the importance of the epics and how the development of archaeology came to pose a great problem for the epics to be considered as sources, it is important for us to briefly state about the definition of epics. So what are epics essentially? Epics are bardic tales about gods and heroes which were recomposed over and over again by succeeding generations of storytellers till they achieve a final shape. But even when the basic outline of a story is formed, it is still capable of further changes in the hands of the poets writing on epical themes. So it is very important for us to understand this very important feature of the epics. How did they originate? The epics were basically oral sources. They were composed by bards, that is traveling singers, who used to weave stories about the epic orally, and this oral tradition kept on percolating from one generation to another for a number of decades, and after a long time they were started to having a textual form. So since the origin of the epic can be traced in the oral form, this oral tradition was capable of changes. Very easily they could be changed. So new layers of poetic imagination could be easily added on the basic storyline, and therefore it was always very difficult to understand what exactly was there and how the exact story or the story with which the epic account came to be started acquired a different kind of a layer. So new stories and new storylines came to be superimposed on the core story. However, the objective of the epic narrations were in the beginning secular. It dealt with the war tales. Therefore, it was known as Birogatha or Joyogatha. That is the tales of worship, tales of wars and like this. But eventually, the secular form of literature gave way to a religious tradition, and this epic along with Puran or antiquity constitute what is known as the Itihasa Purana tradition. Now, to define the epics, we must state that they have a distinctive status from religious scriptures. We know that religious scriptures are known as agamas, and they are also distinct from the scholarly treatises which are known as shastras. So this is important. Since the epics are secular, so they cannot, we should consider this distinction very clearly, that they are neither religious texts, that is they are neither agamas, they are not shastras, that is we shouldn't look in for very important scholarly discussions in the epics. And Akhano, that is epic, and Purana, that is antiquity, are seen as the inspired words of ancient sages in simple heroic verse, lacking the romantic or stylistic features of Kavya. So this is important, that they were not composed in an ornate style. Mostly they were written in very simple language, and they were derived, as we have already stated, that they were created by the traveling birds or the traveling singers who were known as sutas, on which individual generations of authors added their own version of the story. However, even though it is difficult to understand who was the original composer of the epics, as we don't have any record about the epic composers, posterity has given us a few names which we remember, and that is the names of Vyasa for Mahabharata, Ugrasrava and Lomaharsha for Mahabharata. These are all well-known names who are considered to be the composers of the great epic Mahabharata. And as for Ramayana, we have the name of Valmiki, who is usually considered to be a historical figure. Now we will come to the section of epic historiography. How are the historians dealing with the epics? How are the discussions actually going on about the epics? Now, as we have already stated, that since from 19th century, when archaeological history came to be considered as more important form of history writing, there was a debate among historians about the importance of epic as authentic historical account. And in this debate we find that there was a sharp division, because there were scholars like A.L. Basham who did not consider the epic as at all important, while on the other hand we have scholars like H.C. Roy Choudhury who was considering some amount of importance present in the epics. Here we are going to talk about only two historians in detail. One is Edward Washburn Hopkins, who is an astute British historian who had written a number of works on the epics, and most important of his works are social and military position of the ruling caste in ancient India, and the other work which is also very important, that is the Great Epic of India, its origin. So both these works are considered to be the most important works on which later historians actually develop their arguments about the historicity of the epics. Now what happened, this Edward Hopkins, he had made a distinction in the epic by giving us two segments in the epic. One is a narrative section and the other is a didactic section. He is also giving us the names of core story and pseudo epic, or core epic and pseudo epic, as two different segments of the epic. According to Hopkins, the first, that is the narrative section, which is the core story, deals with the story of the military conflict, that is war tales, so which is more secular in orientation. And the later sections, according to him, which were composed at a later time and were superimposed on the story as an interpolation, are dealing with the didactic parts, and these are actually dealing with all sorts of mythical, all sorts of moral stories, and these are found in the 12th and the 13th chapter of the Mahabharata, which are Shanti Parva and the Anushasana Parva. And with regard to Ramayana also, we are having a similar distinction, though Hopkins had concentrated only on Mahabharata. In Ramayana also we have two different sections, one is the Balakanda and the other is the Uttarakanda, which are considered to be later additions. So we have two different parts in the epic which were composed at two different times. Now this distinction, which was made by Edward Hopkins about the two different parts of the epic, that is the narrative epic and the pseudo epic, that has been accepted by one of the most important scholars of ancient Indian history, who is Romila Thapar. Like Hopkins, she has also divided the epic in two distinct parts. Romila Thapar has written a number of essays, and two of his very important works are cultural pasts, and the recent work that she has written is Past Before Us, where we find that she has given us a number of essays. One important essay is Epic and the Historian. In this essay, she has accepted the distinction made by Hopkins. Now, according to Romila Thapar, the epics may not be very important as source for understanding the history of the dynasties, but they are useful for understanding the long-term socio-political transitions happening in the ancient period of India, which is very important. And according to her, the later sections were very parallel, very similar to the Dharma Shastras, which were written in the 3rd century. In fact, some of the sections in Anushasana Parva are direct parallels to Manu Samhita. But though there are parallelism with regard to the subject matter of Anushasana Parvan and the Shanti Parvan with the Dharma Shastras, there is a very important point of dissimilarity also. The dissimilarity prevails in the fact that the writing style was different, because in the epic we find the use of ornate poetry in some cases, where in Manu Samhita we find a literary form which is much more simple in nature. Okay, so according to Romila Thapar, another very important point that is being raised in the epics deals with epic genealogy. So about epic genealogy, what she is telling, that the epics may not give us very important history of the rulers and dynasties, because the genealogies are shrouded in obscurity or in mystery. They don't have any chronological value. But the genealogies, what do we mean by genealogy? Genealogy means the list of rulers, the dynasties, what are the dynasties, who are the rulers coming after whom. So we don't have any exact understanding of the rulers and the date of the rulers and the name of the rulers, because the epics do not provide us an exact understanding about the names and the chronology of the rulers. But Romila Thapar feels that these genealogies, though they are conflicting in nature, they are helpful in understanding the change of a lineage-based society into a political formation in which tribal chiefs were no longer important and the kings were coming. This is a very important point. You know, by way of studying the epic genealogy, the transition of a social system and a political system from a tribal chiefship oriented system to a monarchical system can be understood as Romila Thapar feels. Now, the very early part of the epics talks about the geographical distribution of different lineages who came and fought in the war, coming from different regions. And in this context, I must mention that there was always, a very close connection between the lineage name and the geographical region from where they were coming. And the original story, the earlier part of the story, shows a linkage between lineage and territory, mentioning a whole range of rulers and chiefs who came from the different regions. Some of the myths and legends give us the clue to the story of how the clans proliferated and how lineages were created through migration from one territory to another. This is evident from a number of stories, and one very important story is the story of Yayati. We have the story of Yayati in the Mahabharata, where we find that he had the territory of Madhyadesha with him, and he had two sons, Puru and Yadu. And the story goes like this, that he wanted his youth back. He wanted his youth, and his youngest son Jodu, he did not want to part with the youth, and the eldest son gave him gave youth to his father. As a reward, what happened? He gave the kingdom of Madhyadesha to his eldest son, and Jodu was deprived of it. And this is not merely a story. This story points to a very important aspect of historical development in ancient India, that how one lineage is being divided into various lineages, how there was development of inter-lineage conflict, because we know that these Purus and the Yadus became entangled in a conflict which resulted in a great war. In the great war of Kurukshetra also, we find that they were both actually fighting in opposite sides. So the question of the story of Yayati is important in two aspects. One is how the interlineage conflict is being resulted in a war, and secondly, how the lineages are split into new lineages, and it is connected with the other aspect of the extension of the geographical horizon of the people. So this is very important with regard to the political development that we are dealing in epic genealogy. Now the next point, the next theme that is very important, that essential problems of the epics to be considered as authentic sources. So we know that the epics cannot be considered as authentic as the historical texts are, because there are some essential problems. There are problems in dating the events of the epic. There are problems in understanding the chronology of the events, the rulers, the identity of the rulers. So these problems ranging from the difficulty in establishing the identity of the rulers, in understanding the line of succession, in understanding the genealogy, in measuring accurately the actual extent of their domains, make it difficult for us to treat them as authentic historical source. And maybe this was one reason why standard political histories of ancient India had always remained very suspicious about the so-called epic age. But is it that because of these essential problems in the epics, we cannot consider the epics as at all important? No. With correct reading and with corroboration from other sources, we can certainly find some amount of history being hidden in the myths and legends. We are aware of the fact that there are essential problems in the epics to be considered as historical sources. There are myths and legends, but we can still find some understanding of the large-scale socio-political transition that was taking place in ancient Indian epic period from a careful study of the epics. And if we can corroborate the epic account with other contemporary sources, then the task becomes easier. For example, if we compare the domain of realms of Parikshit with the realm of Januk in Ramayana, it also gives us an understanding of how there was a change in understanding of kingship. You know, Parikshit was only considered to be a Rajan, and whereas Januk was considered to be a Shamraj. So is Rajan and Shamraj are two terminologies only? Is it merely a terminological difference that is being used for both the rulers? No, it's not merely a difference in terminology. Actually, Rajan and Shamraj are, signifying two different kinds of rulerships. While it was Parikshit, we find that he had to depend on the rule, on the subjects to a great extent. His autocracy could not be a ruler of the rank that Janaka could become. So with time we find that the tribal chiefship oriented monarchical system was slowly giving way to a system where the monarch was placed above everyone, and he was almost getting an unquestioned supremacy. So this is very important, that how the epics, even though having some weaknesses to be considered as authentic historical source, can be considered to be historical accounts also. So the next point of critical importance is on the theories or the origin of kingship and its functions available from the great epic Mahabharata. While talking about the theories on the origin of kingship and its functions, Professor H.C. Roy Choudhury has given us an account of the different kinds of rulerships from the Vedic sources and the difference between a kingless state and a state ruled by kings. We have already talked about the way the account of Parikshit and Janaka, the comparison between the realm of Parikshit and Janaka points out to the transition in the nature of kingship and how hereditary kingship had emerged. But this is not the only thing about statecraft that epics give us. Particularly Mahabharata, we are going to talk about Mahabharata more than Ramayana, because Mahabharata outlines the development of a fairly elaborate theory of the origin of state system. And here what we find, that particularly from the Shanti Parva. Now, considering that Shanti Parva was a later insertion, the reflection on a state that it offers belonged to a time when the development of a relatively complex state structure gave rise to a class of literature preoccupied with the problem of statecraft. What does this mean? It means that since we have already told about the different segments in the epic, one segment being written at a point and the other segment being superimposed on the main narrative, Shanti Parva was a later interpolation. There is a consensus among historians that Shanti Parva was added around 1st and 2nd century of Christian era. So it was added at a time when there was already a complex state structure that had been witnessed in India. So we find that this particular chapter of the Shanti Parva was composed at a time when Kautilya's Arthashastra has already been composed. So there are certain parallelism of Shanti Parva with other textual traditions as well. Now, scholars who wrote such texts on polity or state system were described by Kautilya as Arthashastrins, who wrote on Dandoniti and Rajniti. Such concerns were found in the Dharma Shastras as well, sections of which dealt with Rajadharma. But we have to remember one thing, that when we compare the Dharma Shastra literature and the Arthashastra literature, we have to remember this point very clearly, that the Arthashastra literature was more secular in orientation and the Dharma Shastra literature was basically dealing with religious things, and Shanti Parva had more similarity with the Arthashastra texts like Kautilya's Arthashastra, which was more secular in orientation. Here we find that in Shanti Parva, Arjun, the third Pandava, was considered to be a great expert in Arthashastra. That means he was expert in the science of polity, because we find that in the beginning of the Shanti Parva, he was actually discoursing his elder brother Yudhishthira about a few basic lessons of how the king had a responsibility in discharging his worldly obligations to his people. rather than leading the life of an ascetic. We know that the battle of Kurukshetra had made Yudhishthira so remorse, he was so sad by the genocide that was created in the Kurukshetra war, that he decided to quit as a ruler. And here, as a statesman, as an expert in Arthashastra, as an expert in polity, Arjun was explaining to his brother that it was his duty to continue as a ruler, because the duty of a ruler is to exterminate his enemies in order to conquer the world. So it's not unjustified for him to defeat his compatriots in battles, and rather he should concentrate on his worldly obligations and his obligations as a ruler. Now this particular statement of Arjun is very striking, because we know that Shanti Parva was written in 1st or 2nd century of Christian era, while the Prince of Machiavelli, which was written in 16th century Florence, but we find that there was there was similarities between Arjuna's sermons and the sermon of Machiavelli in Prince, where Machiavelli also telling that the primary function of the king is to protect his kingdom, and if for the protection of a kingdom one has to overpower the enemies and defeat him in combats and kill his competitors in combats, that is justified. So the author of the Shanti Parva, through the statement of Arjun, mentions that power for power's sake was not Rajadharma. So it's important for us to remember that at the same time, when the author is telling that one has to wage wars in order to defeat enemies, he is also telling that power for power's sake was not Rajadharma. One has to be a good ruler, and in order to be a good ruler, he has to do Praja Palono. That is responsibility to look after the well-being of the subjects. That is important. And in order to look after the well-being of the subject, he has to do Dharma Juddha. That is, if he has to wage a war for the cause of his subjects, it is not unjustified. So a king should never be hesitant in fighting wars for the protection of the well-being of his subjects. That is important in Arjuna's sermon. The other important point of Rajadharma, that is the duty of the ruler, is that Dando. What is Dando? Dando means royal authority, which Shanti Parva is also stressing. In Arjuna's sermon, we are repeatedly getting the term Dando, and by Dando he meant the power, that is the royal authority which the king wills. And why does the king will this power? In order to ensure the orderly and secure well-being of the society. And this was very important in Arjuna's sermon. Arjuna was also mentioning the term Laukika world. What is this Laukika world? This is important for us to explain. In Arjuna's view of the state, we are finding that before state emerged, there was a pre-state condition. What was the pre-state condition? In this pre-state condition, which Arjuna is describing as a Laukika world, the world was characterized by greed, selfishness and violence. He meant that in the Laukika world, people were not happy. They were not secure, they were not stable. They were continuously being driven by the greed of getting more. And there was endemic insecurity. And because of the greed of getting more, people were killing others, life was becoming insecure and unstable. And in order to gain back stability, in order to get peace, there was the need for a Rajan. That is a ruler. So the need for a ruler was felt when people were living the life of endemic insecurity in a period of Matshonnaya or lawlessness. So Arjuna is telling that Dando came, or royal authority came, because of men's desire to get peace in their life. So here we find that both Kautilya and the ruler of Shanti Parva dealt with the need for a monarchical authority in a natural state. Now this kind of a discourse in Shanti Parva, where we find Arjuna talking about state system, is very similar to the Saptanga theory of Kautilya, where we find Kautilya, we all know that Kautilya's Arthashastra is considered to be a very important text on polity, and where we find he is giving us 7 features of state system which are very parallel to the Shanti Parva theory of kingship. Now, where Kautilya and Arjuna both are emphasizing on the importance of Dando, or the nature of royal authority, with its justification. So Dando, which is the central place in Arjuna's sermons to Yudhishthir, is also mentioned by Kautilya, as we have already mentioned, as one of the 7 features of kingship, along with Swami, sovereignty, Amatya, courtiers and officials, Janapada, commercial centers and towns, Durga, citadel, Kosha, treasury, and Mitra, allies. These are the 7 features of state. Now some other texts had added to this comma or pacification and dana or charity. Now different functions of royal authority or danda was also mentioned by Arthashastra, by Kautilya in Arthashastra and by Arjun in Shanti Parva. You know, the Shanti Parva, while underlining the different functions of danda, also talked about an important function, that is the enforcement of the caste system and family norms. At the same time, danda was to be enforced in accordance with the established precepts of the Shastras and the advice of the king's wise counselors. So what was implied was that the coercive authority of the ruler required to be enforced following some basic legal principles. So one has to keep in mind this very basic fact, that the king had a number of power in his hand, but the power was not autocratic. He had to go by certain rules and regulations and the precepts of certain legal texts in order to use the power. So here we come to the point of the secular origin of state. So while we are looking at the sermons provided by Arjun about royal authority, about danda, we are finding that he was telling the king had to protect dharma. When he was trying to protect dharma, he had himself to be riotous. That means the king had to be dharmic. The king had to be riotous in order to protect dharma and in order to wield danda. What is clear is that this kind of literature, which are dealing with state system and polity, they were developing an argument about the secular origin of state in actual social circumstances. So what do we mean by secular origin? That means there was no divine intervention. Actual social needs gave way to the origin of a state system. So when at a later stage the divine origin of kingship was traced, the elaborate description that the social needs gave rise to kingship cannot be missed out. Now in the Shanti Parva of the Mahabharata, we are having a very clear and detailed description of the origin of state, and there are a number of chapters which deals primarily with this problem. But in Ramayana, which is known as the little epic of India, there also we are finding some accounts about the development of state system and pre-state. Like Arjun was discussing this with the term Laukika world, in the Ramayana we are finding the term Arajoko. The term is Arajoko, which is used in Ramayana. What is this Arajoko? Arajoko means it's very similar to the Laukika world that Arjuna was telling. That is a pre-state condition. In a pre-state condition, that is an Arajoko condition where there was no king or Rajoko. There is no king, Rajaka, there is no Rajaka or king. The kingless people felt insecure. And in this context of insecurity, kingship emerged. In the Ajodhya Kanda of Ramayana also, we are having the same kind of an argument about the development of state, where also we are finding the term Arajoko, informing us that in a kingless state, the wealthy felt insecure. They were feeling insecure. Now, collective consent as the foundation of monarchy. So here this is also a very critical point, because collective consent, what do we mean by collective consent as the foundation of monarchy? Actually, we wanted to examine that when monarchy came about, when state system came about, were there any consciences among people? Did the common people or did the common subjects choose the rulers? So what are we getting from the Shanti Parva about this particular question? We are finding that the Shanti Parva, while talking about an agreement about people, does not give us any example of how the king might have been chosen by them. Why was the Shanti Parva silent about it? Because we have already told that Shanti Parva was written at a time around 1st, 2nd century of Christian era, when kingship had already come about, when there were big monarchical houses. So Shanti Parva was deliberately becoming silent about the choice of a ruler or the selection of a ruler by the common people. So the reason possibly was that by that time the development of monarchy as an institution turned kings into gods, agents of gods. But in a different section of Shanti Parva, through a statement of Bhishma, we find the reference to Mahasammata in the sense of a collective consent of the people as the foundation of monarchy. So Shanti Parva is giving us two kinds of accounts. In one part, Bhishma is telling that people are coming together and they are selecting the ruler. So the question of collective consent as the foundation of monarchy is coming about. So is it only Shanti Parva, or is there any other literary texts which are also considering collective consent to be the foundation of monarchy? Here we are talking about the Brahmana literature. We all know that the Brahmana literature belongs to an earlier time than the epic literature. There also we are finding the issue of collective conscientious, where we find Indra, the god, was being chosen by the gods as their king. So the gods were coming at a consensus and they were selecting Indra as the ruler. The idea of Mahasammata or collective consensus was also present in Buddhist texts, Digha Nikaya. Now, the social and political contract in the origin of kingship. This is a point which requires our discussion, where we find that in Mahabharata, discourse on the origin of kingship, even though it talks about, it actually doesn't talk about clearly regarding elective origin, it mentions some amount of an agreement, some kind of an agreement between Prithu and the Brahmanas. Who is Prithu? Prithu was a king who was chosen by the Brahmanas in a kingless state. In the agreement, Prithu agreed to rule according to dharma or law, to enforce caste rules and to respect the Brahmins. This was stated in the 59th chapter of the Shanti Parva. Now, the 67th chapter also talks about a different kind of an agreement, comparable to the social contract among the people, in which people made an agreement under anarchical conditions to respect others' property and women. In the next stage, we find that the earlier social contract had been systematically violated by those who had made the contract. So the result was that there was a political contract which was emerged. In this resultant anarchy, they approached Brahma for a king, and Brahma in turn asked Monu to become the first king. So it was Monu who became the first king, as we find from the discussions of the Shanti Parva. Now the story eliminates the election of the king in a condition when monarchy was claiming almost a divine status. But at the same time, the story tied monarchy to some kind of an agreement in antiquity. In the process, a theory of kingship emerged which deserves comparison with some of the modern theories of the origin of the state. So here we need to explain this matter a little more clearly, because we have talked about two different contracts. One was the social contract, where people came together. They had to select a king, because the king would protect them from the endemic insecurity. But the agreement, or the social agreement that the people had come about, were broken by the people themselves. So the effect was that the need for a second contract, which was known as a political contract. And here we are finding about Brahma and Monu and a divine intervention. That is important. So what we have understood from this brief discussion is that the epics are important as sources of ancient Indian history. These may not be as important as the historical texts, because historical texts are much more reliable, and in the epics we find the insertion of myths and legends which delimit the importance of epics as authentic historical sources. Then we have talked about the archaeological researches having taken place, but archaeological researches in the major sites have not always been very rewarding, because sometimes they have yielded some amount of information, but at other times they have been linked with some political controversies also, because we know that the controversy considering the Rama Janmabhoomi issue. So there are problems, in treating the epics as sources of authentic Indian history. But the epics, as we have already mentioned, that by a careful study of the epics, if we can corroborate the account of the epics with other contemporary Brahminical Buddhist sources, they might emerge as very authentic source of ancient Indian history. And particularly with regard to the topic of discussion here, that is the polity in the epics, we can certainly consider the Shanti Parva in the Mahabharata to be a very, very important chapter, which if we study carefully can give us a very important account of the development of state system from a pre-state condition where Rajodharma, where the concepts of elective kingship, where the concept of Projapalano, looking after the well-being of the subjects, all these things are coming about, which are actually, answers to the colonial rulers' description of India as a land of despotism. So at any rate, we cannot, consider the epics to be absolutely useless as historical accounts, because with a careful study, the epics can certainly produce historical insights and information, and this is what we exactly call history from the epics. So the epics may not be completely useful as authentic historical accounts, but with proper careful reading, they can certainly, produce historical insight and information. And in this brief lecture, I have not been able to cover all the details, and the details are available in the e-text, and the references are also mentioned in the e-text. And if someone can take over the initiative of reading the epics, the original epics, with some secondary works, the epics can certainly come to some help to understand the history of ancient India. Thank you. Thank you.